Good evening. It's 7:02 p.m. on January 27, 2022. We'll call to order this regular meeting regarding Board of Education and Budget Workshop. Present for the board in person are myself, Chris Parker, Mike Hoffman, Gerard Donna, John Belfado, and Julie Hardridge. Joining us remotely this evening are Stephanie Holton and Laura Gibbons. The first item of business on the agenda is public comment. Members of the public wishing to be heard. Seeing none, we'll move on to item 3, board member comments. Any board members with comments this evening? I'll start by looking to Laura and Steph.
None for me.
None for me.
Sean, sorry.
That's okay. I had sent some questions via the form earlier today. Got them?
Yes, you did.
Okay.
No additional board member comment. Move on to committee appointments. We're still in the process of finalizing some committee assignments. I indicated in a memo to the board some openings, and I'm going to appoint Sharad and Laura to the DEI task force. I'm going to appoint Laura to the long range planning committee. That is it for tonight. We'll probably revisit again on Tuesday. Those are additional appointments for this evening. That brings us on to item 5, the 2022-2023 operating budget. Dr. McKinnon has a presentation to start the conversation.
It was me. I'm just trying to cast my. Oh, I can. Okay.
Great. Good question, Chris. This is live, right?
Yes.
So how would we go about finding a link?
It's live on YouTube.
Just do a search for.
The best way to find the YouTube channel is on the agenda, or I think the easiest way is to search ER9 and then my name will bring up the channel for the right. Thank you. Okay.
Okay, sorry about that. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are pleased to present to you some information concerning some follow-up questions that we have received from members of the community and also from Board of Education members. So we have a few prepared slides that capture some of the questions that you've asked for. I'll be presenting those slides along with Mrs. Scrivani and Dr. Pearson-Hugo this evening. And there were some questions that came in late this afternoon. We could also go through and answer those questions for you as well. So we mentioned during the budget presentation on Saturday that you can ask questions via the question form. We can send that to you again. I'm aware that some of you have used that form because we've looked at, we're getting questions in form. One of the questions that we asked was that you asked us was, in the budget, what comprises discretionary versus non-discretionary items? And non-discretionary items really include things like salary, benefits, transportation, our contractual responsibilities, which include our bargaining group contracts, our transportation contracts, our food services contracts, also Medicare, pension, stipends. These are the things that that we are responsible for paying, that we absolutely have to pay. They also include utilities, obviously, to keep the lights on, keep our buildings warm, special education costs, where we're mandated to, through a child's individual education program or an IEP, to provide services for particular children. So the non-discretionary budget, we really captured data that represents 96.5% of items that were in the budget that you really cannot change. The discretionary items in the budget, and we went through every account line, over 800 lines, and identified items as discretionary versus non-discretionary. Discretionary may include things like program-related expenses and stipends, memberships in some organizations and professional organizations, some curriculum materials, not all curriculum materials, student clubs, and instructional materials as well. So this part of the exercise was actually quite difficult, because do you consider copy paper or pencils discretionary or not? Because they're an instructional supply. Obviously, our children need those items to access the curriculum. The same might go for a particular type of textbook as well. So we did differentiate a little when we looked at some of those slides and some of those data, but we really see the discretionary part of the budget representing around 3.5%. So in summary, 96.5% as fixed costs, responsibilities that we need to pay, and 3.5% as discretionary costs. However, when you zoom into the discretionary costs as well, these monies really cover important programs. So do you want to cut clubs and activities? That really affects the quality of a school system. And those details need to be considered very carefully. So that is the slide. That's one of the activities that we were tasked to do. And I believe that we really analyzed the budget very closely to get a close number on what we think is the right balance. Another question asked us to consider, well, what does Eastern Public Schools and what does Reading Public Schools, are there differences in what our responsibilities are? And so since that was a question, we delved into some major buckets. And we can say that in the Reading School District, we are responsible for workers' compensation in our operating budget. However, workers' compensation is covered by the town budget. And so that's a $120,000 cost to Reading that Eastern is not responsible, the Eastern operating budget is not responsible for. The pension program for our support staff, our secretaries, custodians, and so on. I apologize, I just noted a mistake there, but there's, in terms of a typo, but we're responsible for $558,703 for CT MERS, which is the municipal benefits program where we contribute pensions funds. And that is approximately 18% of an employee's pension. That goes up each year by, went up from 16% to approximately 18%. And it looks at the gross pay of a custodian or a secretary, whatever their gross is, we contribute 18% to pension, and the employer contributes around 3.75%. And so Reading is responsible for pension, and that program is funded by the town of Eastern. There are maybe 8 to 9 different pension programs in Connecticut. So I'm not quite sure what pension program Eastern has because we've never funded it, but they have a different pension program. In the town of Eastern, they're responsible for cutting the grass, and ground maintenance and landscaping is a $35,800 fee for cutting the grass in the town of Reading. And it was taken out of last year's budget. We put it back into this year's budget. And I think we've considered that as a non-discretionary costs. If you wanted to know, how do we classify that? Because, we do believe in cutting the grass and maintaining our grounds.
Why was
Property,
Why was it moved between the two?
what's that?
Why was it moved from one budget to the other?
I wasn't here last year, John. I've been here for about 4 months. I believe that the board, you probably can answer this. I think you wanted us to find the funds elsewhere, or perhaps push that money back to the town and ask the town to be responsible for the landscaping of the schools.
There's some history to back and forth with where that's going to sit, and different representations made over time as to whether or not the town would be able to pick up the services or not. And because it needs to get done, and the town is not able to find the manpower to do it, they have to contract out for it. So at some point in the budget season last year, it was understood that we weren't going to have to contract out for work, but that understanding changed.
So it has to be done one way or
Has to
another.
be
I
done. So
understand.
the town of Easton, their facilities crew cuts the grass. So
And there was a point where the highway was going to do it for us here, but they didn't have the manpower.
property insurance, liability insurance, we cover $95,576 in town of Reading, and property insurance, liability insurance is covered by the town of Easton. So these are the major differences. And that was a question someone asked us to research that, and so we looked at that information.
So that sums to about $800,000, which is 3.5% of the budget.
Sure. The next question, there was a question about technology. Julie, I think you were asking questions a little bit about Chromebook replacements and so on, but there was also another question about software management, different types of hardware. So we wanted to include some information for you and for others. I think Mrs. Stefani is going to talk a little bit about that.
I did mention that I could talk about it all day, so there are a lot of words on the slide. But really, when you take a look at it, we tried to break it out into two different categories, software and hardware. And then when you take a look at that going across, you'll see that the top line is really the idea of management, communication, and then sort of infrastructure kind of is the hardware side of that software. So that's your report cards in PowerSchool, and making sure that you have internet and wireless access points, a visitor system, risk management, making sure that all of our networks are working and up to speed. So that's the software and hardware on that very first line. And then below that is really integration. And so there are standards that are called the ISTE standards, and just two of them are up there in bold, the empowered learners and the creative communicators. And these are really ways that technology can be leveraged for both teacher instruction and for students. So when we think about empowering our learners, what are some of the software applications that really help do that? And what does that look like in the classroom? So that looks like our teacher devices, our interactive classroom technology, printing, copying, different types of software, our Envision Math program, Breakout EDU, which is almost like a game where you solve these interactive problems in groups, things like that. And then the last piece would be tools that really are used to engage the learners. So those are things like Book Creator, where students are creating something that they're going to publish, or they are going to use Screencastify or video to create some sort of a multimedia presentation. So kind of thinking about how students can be creators. And then the hardware piece of that is, if I'm going to be a creator, where am I going to create, and where am I going to create that on? So those are, Chromebooks have a 4-year life cycle approximately. So I sort of broke it out into those different ways. So I just wanted to give you a little bit more understanding about how we broke that up and the thought process behind that, and the sort of planning that goes into where the, how long an interactive display is in the classroom, something that we evaluate, keep track of, how long the Chromebook has a shelf life for, that kind of thing.
So let me ask, what would you describe Google as discretionary or non-discretionary?
So I would say that would be we included it as essential and non-discretionary. And because you have to have something that the students are going to be working to collaborate and communicate with. I think that there are a few other things that we counted as non-discretionary. So an example of that would be that we have a particular security protocol that we use that is above and beyond. So that's a little bit more discretionary.
In addition to that, and we moved away from using an internal network system several years ago to the Google platform. So all of our, I would say, the vast majority of our documentation lives within the Google platform, as opposed to saving things on internal servers. So we've gotten rid of a lot of our older servers, and we use the Google platform for most of our documentation.
The
Yeah, so there
majority
are
of our
some
system, there
exceptions.
are a few exceptions, but the majority of our network is in the cloud. That's where. So I suppose you could say that, suppose you could say that it's discretionary, but it's 2022. I cannot imagine that we would function without any technology.
If we were to function without Google, we would have to go back to an investment in internal infrastructure to support it.
I don't think it's even a conversation to have. Not.
Okay.
I have two questions, one sort of hardware, one software related. This time last year, we had it was in the budget, we were asked to acquire some number of smart boards, whatever they're interactive devices. And I remember we had a conversation that said, wow, that's a lot of them. How many do you really need? And we were told, well, at RES, there are 8 of them that don't work right now. And the board's reaction was timeout. There's stuff that's not working right now. Why aren't we fixing it right now? And so we directed money from last year's budget to go fix those, and then with some money this year's for additional ones. The point of the comment is twofold. One, to make sure that we're addressing technology issues that are breaking in real time and not just running the budget. And second, to kind of get a sense from you as to where we are in the life cycle of those devices and whether there's kind of a refresh plan on them.
So the answer is yes, if something breaks in the classroom right now, obviously we are repairing that and putting things in place to make sure that there's some interactivity happening. It doesn't always happen immediately, and that has to do with some supply chain issues that I think everyone is aware of. And then for the refresh cycle, what we've really done is take a look at what things are really coming to the end of their life. And I will say, things are in good shape, but as they get older, they start to time out. So we've identified, a sort of a 3-year plan for, we think in this year, these are the ones that need to be replaced. These are next year, so that there's a constant refresh cycle for all of those interactive boards. I think it's a smarter, it's a smarter way of looking at that, so that you're not looking at a whole school or a whole wing of something. You're not looking at 10 boards or 20 boards or 50 boards, you're looking at 3 or 4.
I think it would be very helpful from a hardware perspective to have a handle on all of our inventory and what the projected life cycle is.
Yeah.
So that we can be in a position to say it's going to cost X dollars every year to keep this plan moving. We can do that without being in a situation where 2 years from now it's, oh no, we need to triple that investment because this is what's coming to the end of life. We can get that. Yeah, that'd be very helpful.
Yeah, we absolutely, yeah.
For the hardware, every time something needs replaced, are you assessing, hey, is the technology changed enough that maybe it makes sense to change the device we're using, or is it just you do that every 3 or 4 years?
So when it comes to our Chromebooks that we purchase, we actually look to see which one we get a newer model every year. That makes sense for us. And for our interactive teacher boards, we actually switched in some rooms from Smart to Promethean, because it just made sense to do that. It's a very nice quality for a better price.
No, it makes sense. So yeah, so you're upgrading where it's appropriate.
Yes, we upgrade where appropriate, and in fact, we know that there are some Wi-Fi access points that also are coming to the end of their life. And so included in this year's budget is upgrading those Wi-Fi access points so that they can provide the connectivity that students need to be successful in the classroom with Google.
So the software question, then, I noticed in the budget, it seems like whereas in previous years, individual items might have called out, this is for Pear Deck and, World Almanac and et cetera. Some of the lines sort of got rolled together and it said, this is instructional support software or whatever it is. And to my eye, it looked like there was some somewhat material increases in a few of those lines as to what the software investment is going to be. And so my question is whether we're making sure to evaluate to drop pen pad and make sure that we're only adding software that's going to be used and we're not getting into long-term agreements where we're going to lose, have things that we're not using.
So when looking at that, we really tried to break it out into things that are sort of tied to a particular area. So let's say, for example, in science, you want to use a resource that's called, for example, GimKit, right? So that really is tied to a particular program. You wouldn't use GimKit in world language. So that's in that instructional software line. Whereas something that's broader, like Pear Deck, which can be used K-12, that's included in the instructional resources that would be more global. So I tried to break those things out because I think it's important to really understand that there are some technologies that are really designed for a particular program and a particular reason, and they might have a season. And so it's important to differentiate, I think, between those two categories. And I can share, if you'd like, I can share with you sort of the drill down list, but I would anticipate that changing as the needs change and as the technology changes and grows. So another example in science would be that that there used to be a particular type of probe that was really fantastic that people used all the time for physics and for momentum. It was great. But now that actually has been replaced by something that can plug directly into a Chromebook. And so it makes sense just to move away from the older technology because we have the Chromebooks and because every student can have one. And then you don't have to have a set of particular probes in the class, but you have probes that connect to the existing Chromebooks. So those types of sort of subtle shifts are what we're looking towards.
I think people are just can have the sense when there's like the technology and software and all these things as with the concern that we're chasing shiny objects and just sort of adding things on, particularly over the course of the pandemic when everything went remote, especially for families at home. Suddenly it was, a whole different language with all these apps. And the resulting concern is how much are we paying to wear to have all of these things and how much are they actually going to get used, not only right now, but in the future when we're predictably in class and everything.
And that's something that we really talked about quite a bit. And you might remember that some of our grants helped to defray the cost of a number of the software tools that we were using last year and a half. So we've been really working collaboratively and talking with the teachers and administrators to find out what's most critical and then what's sort of a nice to have. And that has led to some decisions about where we can get some savings from making a bulk purchase of a particular product versus saying this is a particular tool that 2 teachers are using because it's supplementing Spanish.
And I assume things like the probes you're describing, we're rolling out a similar program at Easton, so we're trying to find commonality across.
Yes, absolutely.
Do you need utilization reports for all softwares and see which ones are actually?
We have utilization reports for all of them, and we actually signed up to have Google take a look and see how we're using their software as well for teaching and learning and collaboration. So we'll have that report at the end of this year, which I am excited to see, how we're utilizing it and how we're doing that. The idea, I think during the pandemic, there was an idea that, technology was not an extension of the classroom, it sort of became the classroom. And now the idea is to have technology really be an extension of teaching and learning that happens in the class. So some of the software that we talk about, like Pear Deck, is a really great example. That's something that could be used remotely, but it also is a very strong instructional tool in the classroom itself. Just like Google Classroom, instead of thinking of Google Classroom as this tool for remote learners, now it becomes an extension of what happens
Back to hardware, hardware's been around for a while, we've got a lot that are coming towards the end of their lifespan. Is the smart board still the best choice for that center of the classroom technology? I mean, there's built-in projection technology in the laptops, and maybe it's a dumb board that works with my work, that works with the laptop.
Yeah,
Maybe we don't need to invest so much in what's on the wall when we have investment here.
yes,
What's
so,
coming?
so we actually switched from Smart to Promethean. And Prometheans have some of the same capabilities with a few other bells and whistles for a lower price point. And the smarts, that we do have smart software as well, but the smart software is in the cloud now, and so it really doesn't, it used to be very hardware dependent, and so now is no longer hardware dependent, so you can use that software on the Promethean device. So if you've already created lessons, and we have many teachers that have all of that repository, all of that can be in the cloud and then used in a variety of different ways. So the answer to your question is, yes, we're actually moving away from smart at this time. And then if smart makes sense, then we'll move back in that direction. But I think being able to, I think the fact that so many things are now in the cloud, it makes it a lot easier to be able to leverage that, to choose the hardware technologies that really work.
And even more broadly, I think there was a time, probably about 15 years ago, where we were thinking that every single classroom needed to have the interactive whiteboard in front, smartboard at the time. And that still anchored the teacher to the front of the classroom. And thinking has really changed since then. So I don't think it's necessarily an automatic that the smartboard reaches its end of life and we replace it automatically. I think that's really a conversation about the age of the student and the type of interactive hardware that might be appropriate for different needs. So it's not an automatic decision. And since we now have technology leadership, we're able to have good conversations.
I'm grateful that we have this leadership, to be having these conversations, and drilling down on those questions. And at the risk of having you talk about it all night, go back to.
Sorry.
No problem. I've taken some notes, and so you're interested in the kind of a hardware refresh plans. What's at end of life?
Similar to a capital planning exercise.
So we'll do that, but you also asked really about software. Are we getting the value out of the software that we're using, and when we collapse some of it instead of listing them individually? Yeah, I think Sarah may have explained that. Yes. I think there's the normal break, fix, end of life discussions that we need to have. Sometimes we also need to look ahead. Like for example, today we were thinking about how the SAT is going digital in 2023, and what does that mean for our devices? So we were actually meeting with the Region 9 administration and starting to think about does that require an investment in at this point? So I don't want to jump ahead to the Region 9 budget, Mr. D'Agostino, but we were definitely talking about that today as a result of that question. So, moving on, Dr. Pearson-Hugo is going to talk a little bit about class size because there were some class size questions.
So essentially, there are two key things that inform our decision-making with respect to class size. One has to do with the cohort enrollment projections. And then the second thing, probably even more important, has to do with the needs of the students in that cohort. So when you look at our projections for next year, you can see that there's not a big difference between the projection for second grade and the projection for third grade. And yet we placed the additional section in third grade. And that was done very thoughtfully after analysis of the data that we have about the current second grade cohort and the needs of those students, and the belief that the additional class section, creating a smaller class size in grade 3, will be a necessary support for that group. Now, that's not to say that the board might not want to have a conversation also about the second grade group. So you can see right now the average class size is just over 21 students, and that's tipped just slightly higher than we would like to be. And we wanted to bring you a budget proposal that we thought that was prudent and thoughtful, and yet we are keeping an eye on that number. We are also just at the mid-year, and so we're also tracking the intervention data very carefully. And as we know, sometimes in the next several weeks, we gather more information about the students. So I imagine that our conversation will continue about that section.
Stephanie, just so the board's aware, if we were to add a section, we're talking about plus or minus $70,000 probably.
About that, about 65, I think, but
The sections are the number of classes.
sections of the number of classes, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think Chris made a good point on Saturday, which was that, you know, if we continue to have the 5 sections in second grade with the same amount of students, are we inviting, you know, the same problem to happen again? And if you were to scroll down there and look at the middle school, I mean, the 21.2 students in second grade, I mean, that's higher than even any class sections in the middle school. So I do think that that seems really high. So I'd love to, you know, entertain the idea of adding a section in second grade.
What happens the following, week? Just adjust based on what you expect every year, or are you trying to plan for the next 2?
It really has to do with the analysis of the student needs every year. So last year, the board made a decision about the current group of third graders to create smaller sections in third grade. And the feeling currently is that we can now go down a section in fourth grade, so they'll be in slightly larger classrooms. That seems to be the right decision for those students.
With the expectation that when these third graders go to fourth, we're probably gonna have to increase it.
They won't be able to go with 4 sections, it's then it'll be at 26.
Right.
Yeah, that extra teacher would travel with them, I guess.
Yeah, but we had conversations last year, possibly the year before, about how getting to this sort of parity of 5 sections across was going to provide a little bit of stability because the cohorts coming behind were similar in size, but all sort of fit into that 5 section line. Now that we've tipped into the mid 110s in 2 grade, it sort of changes the framework a little bit. But the proposal still keeps us section neutral year over year.
It does, yes, indeed.
Just my thoughts on class size in particular, there's nothing here that really concerns me. In terms of grade 2 being at 21 students, 22 students, that is really about, that's probably the upper bound. And if we went much higher than that, we'd have to think about a possible change. I think where it is now, it's, I'm comfortable with it. Typically, kindergarten, you'd like to see class sizes around the 17, 18 mark. Probably the same for first grade is acceptable. Early elementary school. When you get to second grade, it's usually between 20 to 22 students. Third grade, you can go a little bit higher, but it's certainly maybe 20 to 23. And then fourth and fifth grade is, you're getting up around possibly around the 22 to 24 mark, somewhere in that range. There's a range every year depending on how many sections and how many students you have. There's nothing out of bounds in those numbers.
So the current second year being 106 and 5 sections, then needing an extra classroom next year is based on just the fact of COVID, not the class size.
Shrugging.
I was saying, right now you have 106 students and 5 classrooms in the second grade.
Yes,
Right.
That's the plan for next year.
yes.
For those students going from second to third grade, you're increasing the number of classrooms because they have a need specific.
Yeah, right.
Yes, yes. The feeling is that much of it has to do with COVID. It may not be entirely because of COVID, but these students were in kindergarten essentially when we went.
No, my son's in there. So there's no fear that we're gonna be in the same boat with the current second grader or the next year's second grader the following year because the class size is there.
No, not at this point. Although, as I said, it is something that we really track very carefully. So just the average class size, someone else asked about average class size at RAS. The average class size is 18 at the elementary level. And for that second grade group for next year in particular, if we were to have one fewer section, it would be unreasonably high. It would be at 26 and 27 students a class. And one additional section would give you sections of 18 and 17.
I think to Laura's point, and I kind of can hear what you're saying from home, is that there's just not a lot of wiggle room right there in second grade. And that's just something we have to watch closely.
I guess really the core of the question is, do students who have endured the pandemic as 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds hit second grade and have particular challenges as a consequence? Or do we have a particular concern with our current cohort that is unique to that cohort? Or are we, well, what can we do to look at our first grade and our kindergarten and ensure that we're not going to have a repeat situation this year where we're concerned and we're overcrowded? And then next year we say, now we need to reduce those class sizes in third grade to make up for it.
I think second grade is a combination of those students coming in and missing a significant portion of their kindergarten and first grade years, plus having that particular set of students. There were more referrals and they had more difficulties really getting used to the routines of school. So there were definitely students in grade 2 this year that were quite dysregulated and needed a lot more support. That was the grade level in particular where we felt like we needed to add additional special education support to meet those needs. And Mrs. Del Conte is going to talk a little bit about the Bridges and Basis program and how we need to add support this year and what that looks like next year as well.
Next year, second graders have been in the building full time this year, which will help because the current year second graders had a very rocky first grade.
And kindergarten.
And
Mhm.
If they hit the milestones they need to hit in that second grade cohort, then when they get to the third grade though, they're not going to have the same problems again. I mean,
It's so hard to predict, you know, so our intervention numbers are absolutely higher this year than in typical years. So for our second graders, currently there's a higher percentage of kids who are receiving extra support, but that can be true of almost all grades.
I'm curious if that's going to change by the time they get to third grade because we are far from being back to normal for kids even in school. So are they going to still need the same attention when they get to third grade and potentially fourth grade? I mean, you're right. Those kids in second grade weren't in school first grade and kindergarten. They didn't have that beginning education time. I think all kids are affected. So you're really talking about that grade in particular is really kind of bearing the brunt of it.
Right, those first years of school. And it's so hard to predict. And trust me, this probably is the biggest topic right now among educational leaders because we believe that kids are very resilient and they have re-engaged this year. And what I would like to say is that we're not going to see a much higher rate of special ed identification that suddenly students have disabilities. What we're seeing is that kids are not engaged. They were not available for learning, and our staff is really working so hard to get those kids back where they need to be, knowing that it's a very delicate balance. You know, with kids who are struggling academically, you can't just engage them in triple time academics and still keep them interested in learning. So how long it will take, you know, that is very hard thing to predict. And that's why we're trying to, again, strike the balance of the smaller class sizes so that students don't feel a push and a rush. You know, we still want them to be able to be kids too.
Okay, so I think you're going to have the same problem with your fourth graders going into middle school next year. I'm speaking just from my experience. I don't know anybody else is experiencing, but those kids also didn't have second and third grade in school, really. So now they're going to middle school next year. And I mean, I don't know about anybody else's kids, but mine's completely unprepared to go to fifth grade. So
we're going to know a little bit more information in a few weeks. Right now, we're in the middle of an assessment period in January. And so, Julie, you were talking about like how will we know? We will have some more data points in the coming weeks. So, for example, we have very specific benchmarks that we have the students wanting to meet by the end of second grade. And so there are 4 or 5 data points that we look for where students are in second grade at the end of the January assessment period. And so we'll know that information soon. Things like their Fontaine score, how many sight words they have, what percentage are they reading fluently, and what's their words correct per minute when they read, certain math scores and so on. And then we'll know that throughout the spring and getting towards the end of the year. So we're going to have good internal benchmark data. And I think we're watching those data very carefully in all grades, because the fall and winter period, what I mentioned to you on Saturday is that we know that our standardized test measures were behind between 5 to 10% in reading and mathematics. And our internal data, basically data we use at the beginning of the school year, was also reflecting a lag for some students and increased number of students requiring interventions and increased referrals to special education. What we're waiting to see now, we've started the school year 3 to 4 months later, is are they making up ground in January, and are they going to be making up ground this spring? And we're going to have that information to provide it to you throughout the year.
And it'll be helpful. Sorry, Laura, go ahead.
Okay. I guess there's one other thing, and I don't know if you're going to cover this later, but I'd love to see more info on all of the student clubs that I saw in there at the elementary school, because I think that might help alleviate some concerns with the second grade. I know at least like in conversations with the local social workers and therapists, they'll say that, you know, it's not that students necessarily need more academic instruction to recover from the pandemic. It's more of the free play and social interaction. So I'd love to see how the proposed student clubs will be, you know, are they going to be accessible for everyone? Is there something for everyone, and how do they fit into the student's day?
We did reinstate some clubs at the elementary at that RES this year. We included some clubs like the Garden Club, the Kindness Club, and there were a couple other clubs that we included in the RES budget. And in the John Reed Middle School budget, we actually reinstated a significant number of, I thought, clubs and even field trips, which I think currently are reflected in the John Reed Middle School budget that weren't in this year's budget. But we can get you more information on that, Laura. So you're asking for just more information about clubs and student activities, because you see
just in general. And I think too, you know, if those were listed in the discretionary spending too, but I think that those are really important to keep around. So I think that just being able to understand those and speak about them with the public would be helpful too, as we, you know, once we move into getting this budget passed.
One final question on this class size issue. As we're balancing the question of second grade next year being at 17 or 22 kids or whatever sort of the switch would be, is there another option, whether it's dedicating a floating power to that grade level to sort of assist, so that if we're going to have a concern about 20 or 22 kids, having that additional body to float around and help, would that be a middle ground on this question?
Something we're considering. This year, our greatest challenge honestly has been hiring people. We had the grant funding to fund a number of additional support positions. Very difficult time finding people. So we can hope that next year will be a better year, hopefully healthier year all around.
Do you know why? Is it the compensation wasn't enough? It's just not, didn't want to come.
I would say a combination. I don't think our compensation is drastically below other areas for para-educator roles. Some people were still concerned about health and safety. Also, we were competing with every other district in the area trying to do the exact same thing with the funding.
Everybody staffed up at once, and there's that much staff.
okay, we can get you some information on a plan B for grade 2. The idea of additional paraprofessional support, paraeducator support, instead of a 6-section second grade.
I'm just wondering what the middle ground might be.
It could be a middle ground. The next question, Dr. Pearson Hugo is going to answer this as well, but there was a question in the Google form about what exactly is social emotional learning? Why is it in the budget? and what were the locations of social emotional learning described in the budget? The second,
I can do that. So I'm sure if you Google social emotional learning, you could find all kinds of different definitions. I turned to our board policy. So by policy, you can read the definition there of social emotional learning, the process through which children and adults achieve emotional intelligence through the competencies of self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. So when we keep that definition in mind, it makes it somewhat difficult to identify very specific areas of the budget where that's funded. Because as you can imagine, that's just a very important part of learning to live within any kind of community. Right? Students need to know how to get along with one another, how to solve problems when they arise, and how to make good decisions. It's also something that's required in our school climate plans. We know that we have anti-bullying legislation, and we feel very strongly about having a positive school climate, which means that we support the idea of students learning how to be pro-social members of the community. So it's all pro-social learning, how to resolve conflict in a manner so that learning occurs, and it's not just about punishment, although sometimes there are absolutely consequences for inappropriate behavior. This year and last year, we've also seen an increased need for support for students who are struggling with anxiety. I believe that's pandemic related, although the cases of students needing support for anxiety management were on the rise before the pandemic occurred. Specifically within our budget, the board approved program that we use to teach the self-awareness and self-management is called Second Step. At the elementary level, that involves one lesson a week. And at the middle school level, that occurs in health class, and they also use a program called Second Step. The middle school level, it's a per student type of subscription, and the students are engaged in a number of different activities, again, dealing with social scenarios, how did you deal with this problem, how did you deal with peer pressure, et cetera, et cetera. In grades 5 through 8, there are some supplies for school counseling. And at Reading Elementary School, there are also some supplies. We've added some new bullying prevention resources, and that's a complement to the Second Step program. We use something called restorative practices, and so we train our teachers to also then support new teachers. And restorative practice has to do with how we resolve conflicts in a way, again, that has to do with learning and focusing on teaching students how to manage situations so that it's not about one right and the other person being wrong, and I'm the winner, you're the one who's being punished type of thing. So we bring people together to learn how to discuss issues and solve problems in a way that is productive. So our teachers have received professional development in this area, and we have a number of teachers that have undergone much more training, and they in turn can train our new teachers. So there's some places in the budget where we provide time for our sort of trainers and trainees to provide that PD for new teachers. And then finally, there's a stipend for the Kindness Club facility. That's certainly something that supports social emotional. Yes.
So once teachers are trained, then does that cost go away?
When does it go away?
Does it?
In terms of the training, well, every year there are conversations about positive school climate. So while there would be different training for a brand new teacher, the conversation about what are you seeing in your classroom and how can we address these issues, there would still be a staff discussion. I don't think there's a cost, although certainly would be time at a faculty meeting or another type of PD session, but not necessarily with a cost.
So this is a cost that could eventually go away.
The Kindness Club facility, there's a stipend.
I mean, training.
The training, in theory, it could be reduced greatly. The new teacher training essentially is the time that the teachers, the number of hours the teachers being paid.
Is this something, I'm sorry, is this something new that kind of developed out of COVID? Because
No.
I'm new to school board, so I don't know if this is something that was around prior to,
No.
the anxiety and things that came across.
The
during-
legislation to provide a positive school climate and to have the safe school climate plan has been around since 2012. So almost 10 years old. The increase in anxiety is newer, but as I said before, I can't say that it arrived with the pandemic. We were seeing cases on the rise.
We talked a little bit about new staff that's reflected in the budget. At Reading Elementary School and John Reed Middle School, there's an additional paraeducator to provide reading support for those students. We've talked a lot about students struggling academically, and the Reading School administration reflected an additional reading para. The John Reed Middle School also reflected kind of a multi-purpose paraprofessional. Both of these positions we consider short-term using grant funds. So we would have to reevaluate whether they're in the budget the following year. But right now, we see this as a good use of the ESSA funds. Yes, yes. Special education, we actually had a really in-depth presentation tonight from Mrs. Del Conte about the Junior Bridges program, and there were actually questions in the budget, the questions in the form that we saw about what is the Junior Bridge program, what is the basis program, what does a behavior technician do, what does a social worker do, what are their responsibilities, and so Mrs. Del Conte is going to talk a little bit about that program, including what is a behavior technician, and the request for facilities are really 2 positions, an additional mid-shift custodian at Reading Elementary School to keep up with the cleaning in the building based on custodial standards for the amount of square feet in the building. I think this request has come and gone each year in the budget process, and it's a returning request to see how far this gets and see whether it survives the process.
I feel like Mike and I have cut custodians every single year.
Oh, I don't know about that.
It feels like you're at the presentation.
And something that I'd like to present more information about next week is just more in-depth information about the facility, the K-12 facilities manager, which would represent a third of a position that would be shared amongst 3 districts. And obviously we need to talk to Reading, talk to Eastern and talk to Region 9 about what the model is for that. So I'm going to provide more information next week at one of our workshops about that.
I have a question about the facilities manager. So it's my understanding, and I could be wrong, but I believe the town of Reading has a facilities manager. And have we had any discussions on whether they can fill that need for Reading rather than us go out and hire someone? I think it's similar to the topic of them mowing the lawn, which I think that they should be doing since we do have a highway department, but I don't know if we've discussed this at all with the facilities manager.
We have had, I think we need to have more discussions with the first selectman. I think they do have some type of facilities manager in the budget. It is uncommon, I will say, that a school district the size of Eastern Reading and Region 9 does not have a K-12 facilities manager. Certainly the districts that I've worked in, and probably most surrounding districts, have someone that's dedicated to managing facilities of all schools. And that management really looks at the standard breaks and fixes that happen and managing oversight of the custodians, but also looking at capital repairs and significant repairs in a building over time, and being responsible for the vision of that plan. So there's a lot of things that happen in a building, from just think about this year, the well that didn't work well over at John Reed Middle School, and a lot of time it took to fix that problem. The boiler problems that we've had at different schools. And I'll talk more about this next week, but there are facility studies that were recently done that talk about the condition of our buildings. Some of our buildings are quite old and there's some significant needs that need to be addressed. For example, in both of the schools, Reading Elementary School and John Reed Middle School, it is recommended that we replace either part or portions of our roofs. And so when you look at the type of expense for replacing a roof, could be anywhere from $1 million to $3 million. And think about someone who could oversee that process, develop a request for a proposal, review bids, and then multiply that by 20 different projects at each school. You can see that someone is almost like a general contractor that is handling a lot of projects at once. So
Right. Okay.
it's not just so in the other two districts.
Okay. Yeah. Do we know, will the first selectman be joining any of our, upcoming budget workshops so that we can discuss? So, I mean, it sounds like the facilities manager probably doesn't make sense to put through the town, but, will she be present to talk about some of those other issues?
I believe Chris has invited members of Board of Finance and the First Selectman's office each budget workshop.
Yeah, the boards of finance and selectmen have been invited to all of our meetings, to the extent they're interested in attending. If we have specific questions for the first selectman, we can see if she's available to come to one of our meetings, or we could run those questions through me or Dr. McKinnon, and we can do that.
One of the things I'll do next week is provide you with a sample job description of what exactly a facilities manager would do, what their responsibilities are. That might help.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, I definitely would like to follow up on the lawn mowing piece at least, because we do have Park and Rec using the facilities. And so since they're using the facilities, I do see at least some of that budget being, town related.
At this point, I'm going to ask Mrs. Jen DeConte and to come up and provide a little bit of information about the Junior Bridge program and special education. And I'm going to bear with me a moment while I transition to your presentation. Okay.
I tend to speak a little softly, so you can't hear me, please, and I'll also just speak up. I just wanted to kind of highlight where we are and where we think we need to go to support our special education students. So first, my vice chair, Hank, is also here, she's also been instrumental in helping us put together the support of the students. So, thank you, Jen. What's next slide? So I think we need to kind of look at the backdrop, because you guys get a board support from us every month. Which talks about percentages, and that's really the percentage in real time. So when we look at December's numbers, we're comparing a snapshot of December's percentage rate. And I know that the feeling has been is, are our numbers going up? Are they going down? Where do we stand? This is actually a growth trend, looking at the percentage of students who have been identified as IEPs. So when you look at our academic average, the growth rate in the state of Connecticut is about 2% every year over the last 5 years. So when you look at our neighboring communities, Reading's growth rate has been about 2.4, 2.46. So, so we're pretty comparable to where our neighboring.
Where does Region 9 fit on that list? Where's Region 9?
What?
Does Region 9 have a number? Like, what's the Region 9 growth rate?
I'm trying to understand the question.
So we're looking at the different town growth rates, and we're a K-8 district, and most of those are 12.
Yeah, so we're these other districts, the way the data is pulled, they're looking at K-12, because we're only 8. But in the state, they break it down into how we compare against their pre-K.
So is that K-12? Are those K-12 values?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But that's a Reading K-8 value.
That's just right.
So do we have a Joel Barlow 912 growth number? I'm curious how that balances.
I don't have all of them. So what? I mean, I could pull it for you if you want, but we can look at what region nine.
I'm just curious because that helps you compare a K8 to a K12 to see which way it weights it.
Yeah, I mean, I could certainly do that. So, what I just want to be transparent is that a lot of neighboring budgets have had their presentations. So the way the data is presented here, there are neighboring districts that are presented the same way. So, like for example, if you were to look at Richfield, if you were to look at Bethel, a lot of them they don't include Region 9 on their data program. But I can certainly go back and give you that information. So one of the last year when we did that, the board was thankful to add to the bridge program, particularly in the middle school level. So I just wanted to just kind of remind you what was the goal for adding into the bridge program. So really, we had 3 goals. The big primary goals were the first one was to expand our continuing service to our students. We looked at, the needs of all of the students from a high level view. And we said, we had a gap. And that's where the junior bridge filled that gap. At the middle school level, we had students moving up and we wanted to know how we could support those students. The second purpose of the program really was to provide a safe harbor for these kids. We knew some of these kids had some emotional challenges. And wanting to find a way to support these kids with emotional challenge. So this program also is a safe harbor. And the third one was really develop in-house programs. And we talk a lot about when we send students out of district, they lose that connection. They lose the connection to the community. They lose the connection to the school, and that's often what makes it challenging to bring them back into the community once that connection is lost. Also, we have a high standard of excellence in Reading. We hold our students to a high standard of learning, and sometimes that expectation gets lost when they're not in their community too. So we want to make sure that we have our students have access to excellence and rigor. So really, when you look at those are the 3 big points in developing the bridge program. I just wanted to put that as a reminder of why we put the program in place in both REF and so I shared this slide with you earlier. So what we did was we're breaking it down into the buildings. So this is only looking at REFs. So when you look at the slide groups of September 1 to January 18, we started the school year with this continuing service. We had 1 bridge class, which is the green box on the bottom, and that was the self-contained class. So we had about 6 students in there that really needed that very small environment. And we had a teacher who was duly certified, working very closely with the grade level teachers to make sure that those students had access to the grade level curriculum, but yet it was still in that small classroom environment. That program also, we had our school psychologists and our school social workers going into that class 2 to 3 times a day to provide social emotional support to those students. Yes, sir.
Were they all of 1 grade level or different grade levels?
You
Were they all of 1 grade level or different grade levels?
No, that class was a multi-grade level class. So we, out of the 6 students, I believe most of them did center around the 2nd grade cohort with the few, I think, in kindergarten. We had 2 in kindergarten first, and it might have been 2 in 3rd grade as well. So even a multi-grade class. So the teacher, we were very fortunate. The teacher who teaching it is duly certified. So he's gone, and he also had a lot of support in the classroom. So what we ended up doing in this particular class was coming up with different stations. So the teacher would teach to the 3rd grade student some math and give them kind of activities. We moved to the 2nd grade group, 1st grade group. So we've been monitoring very closely to make sure they have access to the grade level curriculum. But it is a multi-grade class. So that is what we've been doing that's how we started the year. Our basis program is a different program than the Junior Bridge program. The basis program is designed for students who are on the spectrum or need what we call discrete trials. So behavior, not social emotion, not their primary need for needing that level of support. It's more because those students have a different learning profile. And then, as you know, as we move over, the out of district option is always there if we cannot support the student in their home school district. Given the challenges that we experienced in the beginning of the year, we did identify about a handful of students that needed some additional support, and we could not put them in self-contained class because then the class would have been too large. And that means that none of the students would have been able to access the learning. So what we've done is we created a continuum within the Junior Bridge program. So we have our self-contained option, but we also have what's called a consultant teacher option. Now, this is a very New York term. I spent 18 years in New York. Consultant teacher really means that you've got a certified special ed teacher that is working alongside the regular ed teacher for the students who do not need self-contained option. But they need those strategies. The teachers need a colleague that they can bounce ideas off of. How can we support these students in their classroom community? So we have probably about 6 or 7 students that are also receiving what we call consultant teacher. Again, it's multi-grade. So our special ed teacher will go into a classroom, observe the student, work with the student in the classroom to support the student. And so far, the students have been responding well. We're making sure that the students are in the right program. The special ed teacher is only part of the model. We also have a BCBA, board certified behavior analyst, that is also working with the student to make sure that they have what's called a behavior plan. So we are tracking the behavior, we are tracking the data, and then we tweak the interventions that we provide to the student based on the data that we receive.
Jen, what's the difference between a consultant teacher and push-in special ed service?
The push-in special ed teacher, this is where you see structured literacy. These are the teachers that the student may be called out for reading, writing, math. So that's really the difference. The bridge is looking specifically at behavior. So that's really the primary difference. And then, of course, we continue to have the out of district option for students that we feel that we cannot manage in the building. So then when you look at the next slide.
Jen, just to summarize, we started the school year with this model. The basis program supports students on the spectrum, which means students that could be diagnosed with autism or Asperger's, for example, right? This program supports students with more complex behavioral needs. Based on the number of additional students needed support, we added this program here. The basis program is still the same model. And so this reflects the addition of the teacher into the budget for next year as the junior bridge teacher, because this is where we've added more staff at this model at this point in the year, because we noticed more students needing support.
The reduction of size of that yellow box is not meaningful, right?
No, right. We're basically splitting this program because
It's not
we
suggesting
could
the
not.
basis is smaller.
Thanks for asking that
That
question.
is correct.
As I look at it, yeah.
So,
But proportional.
we had an increased numbers of students needing support, and those students would not fit into this program. The class size of the program would not have been suitable.
We should take nothing from the size of any of these
Correct.
boxes as being a
So then we understand the split ed program and junior bridge.
It's not like the out of district box got bigger because we're outplacing before.
Do we know how many students are in each program?
We do. We do.
So again, you have to also remember that the bridge program is the one program which allows students to come into the program that are maybe not, they do not have an IEP. You know, some of these students could be Section 504 students, or they could also be students that maybe have moved into the district and maybe need some additional support because of the expectations. Some of these kids may also only be in the bridge program for a short period of time. And then as they learn the strategies, they will move out. So what we've done here is we've created a continuum within our larger continuum bridge program. So it's a step down for maybe kids in the self-contained, they need something that's less restricted, where they go into the gen ed classroom full time. Or for the gen ed classes if they can't access the curriculum, they may need to go step up into a more supportive environment. So what we're doing is we're trying to create a continuum within our continuum.
But how many
So
students?
then
are
if
in
you
the
go to the next slide,
Jen, there was a question about how many students were in the basis program, how many students are in the bridge program. Just get a general picture.
we have, Jen hasn't even committed to that. So I guess we have about
Come on, Jen.
We have 6 in the self-contained classroom and 7 in the consultant teacher model. But those numbers are our special education numbers. Do you want to talk about the fact that there are 2 other?
Yes.
There are 2 other students in the consultant teacher model who have 504 plans, which means they do have a disability. It is not under special education.
And what about the basic program?
Oh, gosh, I didn't know you were gonna ask me basis. Let me count in my head real quick. 4, 5, 6. There are 6 that are in kindergarten through 4th grade, and then we also have the basis teacher does consult with some of our preschool students, with 3 of our preschool students.
So maybe 10 students.
Okay, but in the junior bridge program, we have 2 teachers teaching 9 students.
So in the junior bridge self-contained classroom, there are 6 students there, and that is, we were considering that at capacity because of the level of need of those students. When you're talking about case sizes, caseloads for teachers, it's not just about the number of students, it's also about the significant needs that a child has. So 6 students on one teacher's caseload is, you can't necessarily compare that to another teacher might have 10 students on their caseload, but there's differences in the needs. So yes, the self-contained classroom that has 6 students, but that teacher's busy.
I also wanted to share that the average caseload in pre-K through 8 hovers around 8 students. So each teacher is responsible to make sure that 8 students, that the meetings are scheduled, that they may schedule parent meetings. So each teacher has 8 students that they're responsible for. That's about an average.
Question, follow-up. Self-contained means it's just those students in that classroom with that teacher. You said 6.
In self-contained, yes.
Right, and then in the consultant teacher model, it's a regular classroom with those students mixed with gen ed
That is correct.
and junior bridges together with 2 teachers up front, one that's the special ed teacher and one that's the gen ed teacher.
That's correct.
And it's all just floating between a number of different sections, so it's not a permanent full-time arrangement. It's one, so, well, it's kids of different grades that they're floating.
It's stratified. So for example, if I'm the bridge consultant teacher and I have 6 to 8 students on my caseload, I may spend, a percentage of my time in classroom A working with that teacher. And he's not one teacher, another teacher, they all work collaboratively. So the teacher might say, this is what I'm seeing throughout the day. Do you have any idea, thoughts, suggestions of what I can do? And they make sure they have the accommodation and modification in place to support those students. Now, each student may also be pulled out, for short periods of time. I see you're having a hard time. So, Mike, why don't you come with me? Let's go out here, let's take a walk. What strategies can you use? In fact, I actually observed one student, the teacher working with one student, he was having a hard time in music. And the special area of the FPA is sometimes a challenging for a student because it's not a traditional classroom. She was able to pull the student out and said, what's going on, buddy? Tell me what's happening. And the student was able to articulate what was going on. They came up with some strategies. The student was able to write the strategies down. And he said, well, what if I can't tell my teacher what's going on? She would just hand the teacher the notes, which said this is what I need. So that is an example of an intervention in a strategy that the student is learning to use to say, you know what, I'm feeling overwhelmed. But they have to be explicitly taught those skills and strategies. I hope that's just an illustration of exactly what you're able to say. Richard Moon, the next slide. This is just the current continuing services we went through RES. And again, last year we put in the junior bridge program at the John D. building. And we have a handful of students in that program. Again, we try to keep the numbers low. All of these students, with the exception of one, are getting their instruction mostly in the genetic class. So they actually are in their schedule to be in the all of the academic classes, but they may have to come out of those classes so they get a research room with the bridge teacher, for additional support. But again, the other programs are programs that we've had at the John Reed building for a number of years. The basic, the content lab and the pull-out, and again, out of district. So this is where I think we talk about cost. And I've said this many times, especially at the moving train. We run PCT meetings throughout the year. So this really is just a high level view of what the cost implication is. So if you look at the Ed Insight, this is based on the October snapshot. So we know how much Reading, what the average per week expenditure is for Reading. The tuition for out of district students is a range. Some programs, day programs run maybe $68,000 to $69,000 per student, and it could be as high as $145,000 to $200,000. And often that is considered investment. So that's why we can't come up with a fixed cost. That this is how much it costs to send a student out. Each program has different admissions criteria. They will only take students with certain classification. And again, the private schools do set their own rates. And transportation, as you know, is another big factor in transporting students. I do know that transportation department works very hard. We try to do things like ride share with other districts. If Wilton or Weston is sending a student to the same facility, we certainly try to do ride share with that. So again, transportation is a range.
Do we have any outplacement students? Do we have any outplacement students?
It's on the bottom of the slide. 13 students, the outplacements, the number of outplacements.
I don't have
That's the Bridges enrollment.
Year on my work report.
That's the Bridges enrollment.
Oh, good.
But the outplace is more like 7 or 8.
We have it.
I
That's
think
in our
it might
enrollment.
actually be on another
It's in
slide.
our enrollment report, I believe.
One more question before you leave that slide. Is that
Here,
transfer?
so if you look at this slide here, this is, we're gonna jump ahead a little bit. So this is really where, right now, we have 10, we have about 11. So this slide we put together to show the cost for the student you would have to outplace. So when you look at, for example, if we did not have a bridge program at RES, you would have to probably consider outplacing those 10 students. So we came up with that range of what that cost would be. But because we do have a bridge program, we would only send out one student again, we're not able to maintain that one student. And at John Reed, if we did not have a bridge program, we would have to look to outplace another student. But we do have, even with the bridge program, we still have to outplace 4. So those are where those numbers are coming from. Again, these just the estimates that we looked at. Some of these numbers, we know where the kids are outplaced. If we had to outplace them, we took the CES tuition. We said, CES closest, program that what we call therapy-based program. So we just said, hypothetically speaking, we send these 10 students ready to the CES program based on the tuition, about this is what it cost. So we.
If they all went to CES, would it really be $29,000 each in transportation?
Yeah, that's usually when we ask.
Even if we're sending them all in the same van together?
The numbers that were given to me, they say they break it down by per student.
So probably
Some of them, remember, some students need 8.
We have, I'll give you an example, we were talking about this today. We have 2 students going to the same outplacement location. They both needed individual vans, individual aids.
In addition to
The
that.
2 students could not drive in the same van. 2 going to the same location.
Why is that?
One of the students had such significant behavioral needs, could not travel with another student.
This all falls on public education.
Yes.
I've never heard of this before, so-
No, it does, yeah. So let me just go back to this slide. 80% of our students are in this model, in general education classroom, at $26,000 per student per pupil. Let's say 10 to 15% of students require some type of intervention, still $26,000 per student. Some students require special education pull-out services, reading, writing, and math. These are the programs here that if you think about the old manual transmission in your car, okay? First gear, second gear, third gear, fourth gear, fifth gear, outplacement. If we didn't have this fourth and fifth gear as a continuum of services, then students would be jumping from this step to this step. And at this step, instead of paying $26,000 a student, you're paying approximately $100,000 a student. Tuition, not including transportation. So school districts put these programs in place to not only keep students in their neighborhood schools and provide them with support because their parents want to keep them with their friends and their community, but it's also a cost-saving mechanism as well. So really, this slide here talks about the differences between having programs and not having programs, and what the potential savings is if we didn't have a program. You'd be actually paying more in tuition and transportation to outplace students.
This is what it would look like if we didn't have 4th and 5th year,
Exactly.
right?
Right.
That's junior bridges and
We're
basic
just fourth,
being outplayed.
we're just fourth here. This is just bridges. This is this is just bridges. This is
No, I haven't
not
And
many
this
basics.
is just looking at those basic students. not
Okay.
looking at-
If you drop basics, you can double that number.
Right.
There's a tuition cost that's $314,000 for one student.
That's probably a residential replacement.
That's where a student goes to live at a particular school.
And that's still the town's responsibility.
Yes. Now, there are areas in the budget called excess cost, where school districts get reimbursed to a certain extent, a certain percentage of the per pupil expenditure of this kind of when a student is outplaced to a program at $314,000. If it goes above 4.5 times the per pupil expenditure, which is $26,000, which that does, the state will reimburse the school district up to 70% of the value above 4.5. some type of sliding formula. And in our budget, we've actually indicated where those cost reimbursements come in. And over time, the state has reduced those reimbursements. And so,
By increasing the multiplier, well, just not funding the program.
well, right, so there's, in one of our cost centers, if you go back to the cost center page, actually, I can show it to you. The cost center in the special education cost center on the top talks about excess cost adjustment. You can see that ratio.
About $200,000.
Are school districts buying houses in other school districts to, because that $314,000, I can see people doing that, especially if they only do another school district to try to save money.
Have you considered Richmond?
So when these programs are very, long story short, these programs are very important because they help students and their cost saving mechanism. And you constantly have to think about ways to provide services along that continuum, third, fourth, and fifth year. And if you're really creative, if you have extra money at the end of the year, you could even contemplate buying your own van. Because if you're paying $380 for a one-way trip somewhere, and you could lease a van yourself for $30,000, and you've got $300,000 left over at the end of the year, you purchased a van, and then you had a paraprofessional do some driving. You're going into the transportation business, but sometimes school districts look for efficiencies in that way. And I've done that in my previous district, where we actually decided it's not economical to do it this way. We're going to do it this way. We're going to go out and buy our own van and get up people trained and so on.
I do want to
That's
add
different.
excess cost for a minute, it means we have to spend X amount of money. That we first with the state. Reading, is pretty high. I think you're hovering about $104,000. So you have to also remember that all of these students have on here, that we talked about, may not meet that excess cost, right? So just because they're outraged doesn't mean automatically that it's triggering that pressure. Again, it depends on the program, it depends on the child. But on that slide, you also see something that says tuition payment. Means that we have also been accepting students, we've been considering students from neighboring districts as well. So if you have an interest in having students attend on the Reading Richmond. So we have that with tuition TBD, because that is something we're figuring out. What would we charge in the district to have students come to our program? Are there any additional questions? I think. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just want to apologize to everyone. My computer is going to go to sleep soon at 4%. So we're going to see if Chris can take over. We're done with the presentation.
Well, back to you though.
We're back to me, and that was our presentation for this evening. I've got a USB-C.
I was gonna say, I would also like to record it.
Okay. I'm going to bring it up
Fishing
and start.
rod.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm not.
So you need to go through these other slides, so just some of it.
There's some, not, yeah, I'm good.
Okay.
The only other thing that there were a couple of other questions that came in today. Chris, you asked a question about district-wide non-certified, the MERS contribution, which is in, again, the district-wide non-certified area, and you noticed a missing value. And we found a mistake in that particular line. Essentially, long story short, we were missing $28,000 of the budget. So there's a change that the budget basically increased from 4.9% to 4.94%. And so that is a swing to cover the pension for school secretaries over one of our schools.
And that's employee benefits, non-certified other payments.
Yes. That was a question. Thank you so much. Very nice.
So that's the 12, that's the 235 option.
Yes, and that was in, yeah, so it's in the district-wide tab, non-certified other claimants. It was, looking at it was by.
And to put a finer point on it, that brings the increase in that line up to 17.8% or $88,000. And that is purely because the state has shifted the allocation rate from 16.75 to 18.26% for next year. And that's, I think, the third or fourth year of a large scale step up. Sure.
Then you asked another question about anticipated retirements and did we budget for retirements? So that, in some districts, that's called breakage or it's called attrition in other districts, but essentially a teacher retires at the top of the salary scale, perhaps they're making $100,000 a year. We hire someone at $65,000. That potentially is a savings of $35,000. We have 3 anticipated retirees next year. And so the question was, did you factor that savings in? And the answer is yes. Okay, we did do that. Including the retirement of an administrator. Okay, that was factored in as well. Yep. And there was another question generally about what is a basis teacher, what is a program, what is a bridge teacher. I think we answered that tonight. The role of a social worker and the role of a behavior technician. So, Jen, can you just explain what a social worker does and what a behavior technician does?
Right, social worker is really, but I think he needs to go back a little bit first because we call it the mental health piece, you know, especially regarding our mental health. 2 psychologists, 2 social workers. There's a lot of overlap. But the school social worker really does provide support to students, but can also provide support to students. You know, what community resources can they tap into? So we have a lot of students that maybe that homeschool connection needs to be strengthened. So the school social work plays a big role in that. They also provide support to students in the social emotional learning. You know, they provide school-based counseling. They do a lot of, they may do some bullying investigations, work on claims along those areas as well. They do work a lot on friendships. The school psychologists, on the other hand, do more the diagnostic piece. We do a lot of assessments that are required for special education evaluations. The BT, which is called the behavior technician, is a support. We have 2 levels. We have paraeducator support. We have what's called the BT support. BT usually work in our basis program. We do have a few in our bridge program. Number 1 distinction between a para and a BT is that all of our BTs are what we call PMT trained. So they are trained to de-escalate conflicts. They also do a lot with the collection of data. You know, when we have kids that have behavior plans, we have to do some data tracking and data collection. So the BTs are trained to collect that data. They're also trained to graph the data so that the teacher can interpret the data. So that really is the key distinction.
There was another question, what is taught in world language? And the answer is Spanish and French. There's another question, what is an instructional coach / interventionist? An instructional coach / interventionist, sometimes it's a teacher with an additional certification. And an interventionist is a teacher that is that second gear that I explained before. They provide support for students that need extra, most likely in the area of reading and writing. So they're struggling in those areas, and we have different benchmark assessments that we use to measure where a student is and whether they're making progress. And if we're concerned about the pace at which students are making progress, or if they need additional support, an interventionist will pull a small group of students, sometimes in the classroom, to provide additional reading and writing and math support. So that's one of the interventions.
How does that differ from an IEP? So then it's a longer process.
It's a process that before a student really gets to the special education process, we have to do something called response to intervention, which means that we have to provide them with intervention services first at different levels. And one of the criteria in order to get to special education is, are they responding to the interventions that you're providing? And if they are responding to interventions, then you provide interventions until they catch up. Sometimes you provide interventions to students and they're still struggling, and we watch the intensity of that interventions and the length of time. And if it's taking too long for the student to catch up, even if you're providing services, then that student might be eligible for special education. And that's where we would use the special education teacher, the school psychologist. We would have a meeting with the parent. We would do something called a PPT, and we would get some evaluations, and then we would determine whether the child was eligible for special education. So there's kind of a process along the way, and an interventionist provides support for students essentially who are struggling. And we hope that students get the support they need, and then they don't need support again. Sometimes students need additional support, and we provide them as much support as possible. And at a certain point, we decide that we need to get additional support. So those were questions that were asked, and that answers all the questions today.
I think what I want to do and what I could have signposted to the board a little bit is go around and identify issues for which additional information might be helpful at this stage, and identify areas where we expect that we're going to have to make decisions. I think that some that stand out are the question about the RES class sections and whether or not to add, subtract, or maintain based on what we presented. Questions about health insurance, which we've deferred until next week when the consultant is here. The question related to the custodian at RES. The question related to authorizing the expansion of the junior bridge program, which we talked about a little bit tonight. The facilities manager. I'm sure I am forgetting other items that would be for discussion or for which there might be requests for additional information. So, anybody have anything else to add?
Laura asked about the clubs, I think.
I have technology, software, hardware, student clubs, and related to the class size, the idea of additional support.
Like a plan B, yeah.
And about, sorry, guys.
I was gonna say, Laura, also, talking to the first.
About technology in the hardware section. I did see 4-year life on the Chromebooks, but I would be interested in what the life was on the others. And if we face a cliff on any of them, or if it's a rolling replacement. You know, do we have 50 laptops next year versus 0 this year, or are they 10 a year over 5 years?
I would love to see a hardware replenishment plan that is similar to how we would treat things like lockers and say, how long does it take? When do we expect to turn it over? So that we can create some sort of budget stability, particularly if they're not capitalized.
What was, sorry, what was the one that Shirag just said? I think it was the one I was going to say. I just want to make sure.
Laura talked about the lawn and the blood lawn.
Laura wants to cut the grass. I heard.
I mean, more generally, I think that side by side with what Easton Town covers versus Reading, I think it would be great to just sit down with the selectmen and say, you know, see what we can agree on.
We've talked about that in the past, about the town picking up costs to reduce our cost per student. Therefore, go back state for the kids who need special education. We've talked about that for years, and it's never gone anywhere.
This will be the 3rd year that we'll raise this as a concept, because to get back to Mr. Rowe's question about excess cost reimbursement, we don't see a dime from the state until we hit 4.5 times the cost per pupil on a net current basis. And if we can shift $800,000 that are gonna have to get paid no matter what, the selectmen's budget is what the education budget, it lowers that threshold, which turns into $20,000 or $30,000 a year, depending on what the outplacement costs are.
Yeah.
It's leaving money on the table for the state is right now.
I was gonna ask about technical debt. I don't know if there's an assessment here as far as, are we putting things off that we're gonna have an interest on later? That we should do, but we're not doing it because of it.
From technology.
Yeah.
I'll look into that.
So there's nothing on there, that there's not, you didn't cut things out that you'd like to do versus just for budget.
She didn't say that.
It's a different question.
Well, I think, Mike and Seth probably recall, we had conversations about the STEM lab computers here that got deferred for several years until it felt like they were being helped to the right uptake, but then we pushed them through. I think we want to avoid that through more cohesive, forward-thinking planning on the technology side, so that we see those things coming and we're not kicking the can as a budget cut all of a sudden.
In facilities maintenance contracts, there's some hard time understanding the list, during last year to this year, there's some brand new things that went up, but I don't think they really are going up.
You're at 2,600.
Facilities, make, yeah, the
Facility
facilities.
2,600.
Yeah.
Yeah, for example, last year on lawn mowing, 1,500, this year on lawn mowing, 10,200. I don't think it went up like that.
I think it was because.
Same thing with the water system and the generator testing. Those went up too, but they seem to be the same line items.
And the water testing is probably related to the work at John Reed that's going to require additional testing because the new well is now online. And so that. I was wondering if that was requires additional testing. Yeah.
Well, it's separate. I think there was a line for testing the wells and then there was a line for regular water system testing. And then regular generator testing. Yeah, it just.
So is there a line number?
I saw Megan nodding about the water testing. I think she knows more than she ever wanted to know about well water now.
This is true.
But is it fair to say that increase is related to bringing that well online?
It is. I believe one is actually testing the well water and the other is testing the water that's coming out of our faucets internally.
Okay.
So two different levels of testing. That's my understanding.
And I would actually, while we're talking about water flag and issue, probably for Scott, just to connect with our consultant, Ron Black, who when we were sat down in this building in the summer, had some ideas about what we should be doing with respect to water tank maintenance and efficiency around that, and whether we're implementing those ideas or surfacing those at least, because they have certainly budgetary impact.
I think it's something to also maybe revisit with Ron. They just recently did more testing of our internal water, so just how long that has to continue to happen.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's regulated by the state or, more recent testing has shown us something, so.
Very favorable test, by the way.
Awesome, yes, I'm ready to drink it.
Yes. I think it would be great actually to get just sort of a cohesive update from Ron as to the state of water, not just in this building, but at RES and what we're doing and what he'd recommend we be doing as we sort of finalize it. Anything else in this section, Mike? About the
I just remember, for this year, approving, the full amount for the mowing, the lawn, and I'm only seeing $1,500 in there. And then there's another 1,500, not lawn mowing, but lawn maintenance. Both of those have gone up.
You're looking at the 24 and 23, so those are the two buildings, that's the amount split, the same item. And 24 is gonna be more expensive because RES have more fields. I think it's probably what you're looking at. If you're looking at 424,
We're just looking at 2021, 2022 approved versus, proposed. And to go from 1,500 to 10,200 on one line, and 1,500 to 28,600 on another line.
you're looking at 2,600, 424, right, for both? Yes,
Oh,
row
yeah.
row 6 and row 22.
I believe that's because the board cut that. So the difference is that what was approved this year was cut. That's why it's $1,500, isn't it?
My understanding was it moved out when there was a tentative understanding that I was going to do it this year. And then that didn't.
So that's the difference. But to your logic,
Because I remember putting it in, right, don't remember the part where it came out.
And so now that's the 35,000 that is split between the two buildings in a sort of fairly weighted area.
but we can give you kind of a one pager on what the lawn maintenance contract covers next year in the budget.
Yeah, those are the two things in here, it's the lawn and the water that's, and they represent like all the increase.
And I do think to Laura's point, generally, even if we're going to be in the business of cutting the lawn, we should be talking to the town because they also outsource some of their lawn services and whether we should be having a single contract to maximize the benefit there.
Yeah.
Obviously, helpful.
And could we go back to RFP and bid? Right.
That might interrogate all the bidders. We drilled down on that section a little bit. Any other topics folks have questions or look for more information on? It's sort of a general comment. I don't think it's a surprise to say that it's going to be it's unlikely that we're going to coalesce around agree to a 4.9. And so the question becomes for the administration to ponder, where do you go from there as far as if we need you to get it down to a number that starts with a 3, let's say, where do you come? It's not necessarily a question for tonight, but I think it's going to have to be a question for next week to start looking at the age-old question of if I need to get it to here, what do I take away? I need to get it to here, what do I take away? So that the board is aware of the impact of their trip.
Absolutely. I think that means we look at discretionary versus non-discretionary expenditures. And just to remind everyone, even though we called it discretionary expenditure, that those monies are still very much targeted towards programs and people and stipends and enrichment. The things that really define a quality school system. And we can certainly look at those areas. It's always tough because the budget at 4.9% did reflect some things that the administration asked for that we cut even before we brought the budget to you. And the major budget drivers, just to refresh everyone's memory, were health insurance going up 15%, district-wide transportation going up almost 5%, special education transportation going up 18%, special education overall going up close to 5%, and the facilities increase is going up approximately 20%. So those drivers plus inflation, plus changes in utility, plus increases in transportation costs, and so on, do create significant constraints on the budget. And we do realize that we've got further work to do. It just gets increasingly challenging from this point forward to go into that discretionary area and make some really painful choices.
To sort of put a finer point on, I think what you're saying, if I were to market this budget and say, and somebody asked me, what's in this budget, what's new in this budget, as far as new programs or ideas, it doesn't sound like much.
But not much at all. I mean, we could, there are a couple of things that I would say this is a maintenance budget with a couple of important additions that actually reduce costs over time.
The only programmatic expansion is junior bridges, which is really a cost savings program.
Right.
Your discretionary budget's only 3%, so I mean, remember we said in the beginning? was a very small slice of that pie. So,
Absolutely.
I mean, is any of the non-discretionary budget negotiable? If it's not, then that means everything has to come out of the discretionary budget, which is already a very small percentage of
That's
the
right.
overall budget, which means you're gonna take everything from that.
Is there any possibility for leveraging some of the American Rescue Plan funds? So I don't know, for example, if we were to take the clubs, which are fairly small spend, I think it's probably something like 20 grand. If we were to propose that those go into the American Rescue Plan fund for this year and then move them over in future years when transportation costs hopefully go down?
You know, I think that's a really good question. And what we can do for you next week is actually give you an overview of revenue in the form of grants. And grant revenue is allocated in the budget at different places. We can provide you with a summary of how we've used grants already to offset some operational expenses. So, you know, we are using ARPA funds to fund the paraprofessionals. For example, we have used some funds to fund student intern, which could reduce substitute teacher costs. You know, we do use Title I monies to offset some of our interventionists. There's places in the budget where we reflect the excess costs in special education and where we're using some of the grants to offset teacher salaries or school psychologist salaries and so on. So, but we can actually give you a summary of that because I think that is a good question and we can show you how we've used that.
And I do think that might not be that's a pretty good way to use the grant money going forward, particularly if we're trying to restore.
Yeah, but the
Social
question really becomes what happens when that grant money is no longer available. I guess funds are used up.
Right, that's the key. It's a question of you're talking about scaling back or scaling back up certain club activities or overscaling them for the short term. You have to understand that that's where the backside is. But it's a matter of, to Lori's point, if you could use that as an offset for a very large, for example, health insurance increase this year.
Right, that's fine this year, what happens going forward.
We're assuming.
The theory is that the health insurance is the 15% issue next year.
No, well, we don't know that.
No, we don't know that.
But ESSER funds probably will go at some point. Right. So what happens with whatever it's being allocated for now?
So we can provide that overview. I have a spreadsheet that includes all of the pandemic relief related grants, and they all have a different time span attached to them. All of those grants have been submitted to the state and have been approved. They're designated for very specific uses. And one of the things with any grant is that it can only supplement, it can't supplant. So we have to be very careful in the way that we're using the money, but I think it would be helpful.
Yes.
As far as discretionary, non-discretionary, you know, medical insurance, you know, health insurance, MERS payments, mostly medical insurance. It's non-discretionary, right? But how much we put away for it, how much we budget for it is
Our level of risk tolerance.
up to us, right? Same with staffing. We cannot negotiate new rates with our teachers that the contract is all set up, but we can decide how many teachers we have. Right? So there's within non-discretionary, there are decisions that can be made. For example, just medical insurance alone, certified and not certified, of the increase. I don't know if I'm looking at the right thing, but it was like 460,000 of the increase year over year in the total budget is just from medical insurance and the other payments, which is PERS, right? Something like that. Yeah. So there's a lot of action on the medical side. I'm glad we have Ryan Brown coming. Yeah. When is that? Thursday. 7 p.m.
And in fact, if you have specific questions that you want them to think about in advance, you can send them to me. I'm going to send them a list of questions that I want them to address so that we don't sort of spring questions on them at the last second and kind of get haphazard. I did have a question looking at the drivers again about transportation costs, because when I first saw that it was up almost 5%, I said, oh, I guess some of that has to do with special ed transportation for those costs. That's broken out separately.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering where the upward pressure is on that. Is it purely diesel fuel? Why is it up so much over the contract value?
So the 62,000 there, Chris, an increase for transportation.
I see. Yeah, 4.89%,
Went up $62,000.
62,000. And the on a contract basis, it should be 2%. So I guess the other portion of that is fuel oil or diesel fuel.
There's about 15 lines in here, and one line is I see the contract, the 570 to 587. And there's a whole bunch of other transportation related stuff.
The district-wide cost center was
Yes. And transportation.
So magnet school transportation went up a little bit. Unleaded fuel for our, went up a little bit. The diesel increase, which we're still gonna go with a consortium, and we haven't signed yet, that was offset by some credits, so the diesel fuel is not as, well, it's not gonna be as much of an expense as that we originally anticipated, because I talked to East River and we had a couple of credits there the prior 2 years that I applied to that line. So, and I did go over this with Tina, and it's the contractual increase.
And then field trips as well for $12,700.
that's a legit complete restoration. Got it, right? Okay, that explains it.
That was a true zero last year?
Well, that explains 20% of the change.
That's line 9.
Right.
So, sort of two comments on transportation. One, I like to always remind folks that the bus contract provides for a certain number of districts field trips at no cost. We want to make sure that we're aware of that, leveraging that benefit. And secondly, we talked a little bit on Saturday about talking to first student with respect to rate group optimizations and whether or not there's the opportunity to lose a group in the coming year. When do we anticipate having sort of an update on that?
I sent them a couple of messages, and we're going back and forth about getting some updated route information using their software versus train, I think. So we're in ongoing conversations with that.
And
They initially responded to me with essentially, we don't see any differences between this year and next year. And I think I responded, try again. Provide us actually with some data rather than a kind of response. So we went back to get more information.
It's like 3%, not 2.
on the contract?
Yeah.
I mean, I'll check it. If
Yeah,
it's two, but
I thought it was flat 2 each year from when we did the contracts.
I'll confirm, but I'm pretty sure.
So I just did the count. There's one line that goes from 570 to 587.
Yeah, so did I.
And one that.
It's up 30%. That's
Yeah.
the increase. I'll check.
I could have sworn that we agreed to 2% each year over the life of the contract. We did it, but it's been a couple of years out of that. Check that out. Make the numbers go down.
We have residents attending a magnet school. We have residents attending a magnet school.
The Danbury Magnet, the what's international.
The international, the memo I sent today.
Oh my God.
We just want to make a joke about it. It's the Western Connecticut International. Magnet School. Yes, it's a magnet school in Danbury.
How many schools do we have?
So this year, we only have 2 students attending. We have reduced the number of the slots that we have for Reading students over the years. And next year, we will reduce from 8 slots to 6 slots. In the last 2 years, we're assuming because of the pandemic, we've had far fewer students fill the slots that are available.
it's been feedback that I've got in the community that many families who have expressed interest in that school have not gotten a particularly warm welcome from that school.
Oh, really?
And I think the subtext might be that there's such crowding in Danbury that they're not interested necessarily in pulling kids from the towns if they can avoid it. So I know anecdotally folks have got sort of a not warm and fuzzy feeling.
That's interesting. So there was a time when the appeal of that particular magnet school, in addition to offering a more diverse community experience, was the fact that they included language instruction at the elementary level, and students learned to speak Spanish. And over the years, we've added Spanish instruction to our curriculum. And so, possibly it could be less difficult for some parents.
Is that an option just because there's school choice option for?
We are mandated to provide that choice, yes.
They were the big winner.
Sorry?
They were the big winner, that magnet school. I don't know of any magnet schools in the area. So,
Yes, we have a formal agreement with that magnet school, so that is the magnet school that we use, and we provide transportation to the magnet.
What do they offer that we don't offer here? I didn't understand that.
At one time, they offered Spanish instruction at the elementary level. That was, over a decade ago. And now at Reading Elementary School, students learn Spanish at the elementary level. So what I'm saying is that for those that Spanish was a real draw, Spanish instruction, maybe there's slightly less of a draw, but there are many reasons why people are drawn to the magnet community. What we find is that for families that enroll one child, they typically enroll all of the children. There's certainly several components.
I don't understand what the draw is, or what they're getting out of it that they don't get here.
It's a more diverse community.
Kids there?
Sorry.
But it's not the same cost per student?
Danbury Public Schools, I'm assuming it's a lower cost for students. The magnet school programs receive a fair amount of funding because they create a draw for families in neighboring communities. And so it's an internationally themed school. And so that's really appealing for some people. That community is also more diverse. So some families find that to be something that is very interesting. So for that reason, they participate in more. So we advertise the magnet school lottery through the Reading Elementary School publication, Tuesday Newsday. We publish it on the town website. Many years ago, the former principal of the magnet school and I used to host get-togethers at the North Wayne Library and try to answer questions for families. And over the years, the participation rate has gone down.
Transportation, full district, and transportation for special ed are separated in here, right? Yes. Two of them, account for 167,000 increase. Most of that being on the special ed side. What do we have? We've negotiated rates for those things with the bus company, or is that?
You mean for special ed?
Yeah. Or is that kind of done on a one-off basis? Is it all through our bus company? Do we have to go to our bus company for that work?
Special education students transported out of the district. We actually have many contracts with different vendors, different vendors providing different vans that go to different places.
Okay.
So it could be, I don't think of more information for you about this, but typically it could be students going to Milford versus students going to a different location, and there might be a contract with one vendor to go one location, 2 or 3 students, and a different contract with a different vendor to go in a different direction.
Okay, so we're not locked into our bus company for it. We do go to different vendors for the special ed version of it.
Yes, that's correct.
Our special ed population and the outsourced and the numbers of outpay students hasn't gone up a lot. Do you know if there's is this just general increase in transportation in general, like, trucking that you see for supply chain has gone up, in some cases doubled. We've seen some of that here. What is that that's driving 5 or 20, like a 20% increase just on that one line item, especially.
It's transport, out of district transportation could be transportation for a particular van and a driver, but it also may include an aid for that bus, for that student. So I guess the answer is it depends on whether there's personnel that ride in the van as well.
Or whether the change, why, when there hasn't been a change in the number of special ed students or the number of output students, why the big change in cost unless
You're saying the need is changing.
maybe the need has changed.
The distance traveled might be changed, depending on the placements are.
Right, maybe they're going to different schools, right, and those would be the answers.
Yes.
I don't know how specifically, yeah, but it has to do with having to travel.
Less students per vehicle.
Oh,
Like a COVID thing?
No, for, you were just talking about the special ed.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay, so there have been changes to the need to travel.
Mike, if you want to send us a follow-up email about that, or put a question, and we can provide more information. That's something, if that didn't answer your question, but it could be once the numbers of students that are outplacing may not significantly go up because we're building programs in place, but one student could account for $150,000. Versus 3 or 4 students going to a particular program. So whether you have one or 2 students can tip you in the wrong direction.
Yep.
And if you look at the budget, actually, you actually see here 2 cars shared with X number of students.
Yeah, I'm looking
For
at
one
that right
price
now.
versus 1 student, 1 aid. So on. Like line 25.
Right, so that line item, line 11, you were dropped out, but it looks like it's replacement.
Right.
Like 12, 13.
So you just want more ins and outs, on kind of headwinds, tailwinds, and that.
No, what drives a 20% change? And I think I'm getting the answers, which is the change in the way we're force change in the way that we're going about it because it needs.
Yes.
We also have noticed that in the very beginning of some location, I know you were at the last, but there's a location, and so, so that also might, these are coming together. Places that could be helpful.
Change is indicative of the lines not being straight
No.
across, and as we tried to match them
Yeah,
as best as possible to show you.
I'm in here because the overall is
Yeah.
It's 561 to 667, 105,000.
Yeah.
It's from
19%. That's the flags, that's what we do.
Yeah.
But we tried to match them up, but the descriptions sometimes were not,
Like
we're not apples to apples, but if you see something that you say, oh, you know what, that really, that probably, I see that maybe matched up with something previously, or just, let me know, we can pull up last year's and this year's and try to do that.
Just-
It was a challenge to try to take the budgets and line them up this way.
I don't want to discourage you because I love the way this is laid out and it's really easy. I mean, we would have a stack of paper here like this. And all you would hear up front, right? But even with the stack of paper, this sort of analysis was not possible because that special ed transportation would be in several places.
We can provide a summary of this. We can go a little bit deeper, how many vendors we have, what are some locations? We can provide a little bit more information.
This is a fabulous way to be able to look at it.
Unreal. What a change.
That's right. Don't call my Google. I'm just kidding.
But not really.
No.
Okay, we can get more information.
Other areas on folks' minds. If you have questions, it'd be helpful to be answered as homework. Now's a good time to shout them out.
We will send you the Google form again. That's a really efficient way because you enter the question, keep track of it, we can answer it. Get back to you.
Laura, Steph, any questions?
I'm good.
So I think this is helpful to summarize, but I see on my list, maybe Dr. Kenny, you can read back yours also. I see questions about RPUs for clubs and other things, transportation route optimization, confirmation, contractual increase, questions about water treatment in both buildings and the well, discussion with the town about lawn servers generally, software, hardware, planning, facilities manager, junior bridges, custodian, health insurance, overall classroom teacher assignments.
Yes, good. Check it out.
And with the facilities manager of the town, you should invite her on the spot. It might be that just for her to make a statement about what we're doing at the town level and what we plan to do for the schools or not plan to do. But
Help us understand what your plan is to collaborate.
yes.
I think with that, and then sort of the general thought that the administration is tasked with giving us an idea of where you can go from here to make the number not 4.94, and where the pain points are is helpful, and that'll allow us to settle on a number as rationally as possible. And finally, if folks could get the health insurance questions by the weekend, I can get a quick request over to Brown and Brown. So they're prepared for those.
You can anticipate the layout or their reporting to be kind of what they did a couple of years ago.
I would think it'll be similar to what we got last year.
Was that last year?
So this will be the third year in a row, I think we've had this conversation. Last year, Jay presented to us by Zoom and showed us Eastern Reading Region 9 at the joint meeting. And we went through all of it in that context. Yeah. 2 years ago, sat in this room, and we had a dialogue for an hour also.
The report from last year was the one.
Yeah. All the ones.
Now I remember. Yeah. It's very helpful.
Chris, they finished updating the presentation.
I have not, but if that could get to me, that would be helpful, and I can sort of gut check it and circulate it to everybody beforehand so that they can get familiar with other points.
I'll get the latest to you tomorrow.
And I've also been in touch with the town to get a sense of what their health insurance costs are, because they're budgeting flat year over year, but they're fully through. And so Uptown knocking math is that the budgeting is 0% increase because their per employee costs are way higher. So we'll have to do some math to figure out what that is. It is 9:15. If we've had a productive conversation, we could pick up the budget discussion on Tuesday at our regular meeting. Is there any other questions for anybody? We'll look for a motion to adjourn. Second, I see John. Absent objection, we are